Okay, welcome everyone to our first presentation session. Hopefully many of you managed to catch the plenary session. And then after this, of course, we'll have the first network mixer, which I'll come back to remind you of. I'm Parma Chaudhary, one of the co-organizers. If you have any logistic issues, can't find a link for one of the later sessions or something like that, we do have a great team of helpers in the background, so drop something in the chat and they will help you out. But I'm going to hand over now to Gina Pieters, who is going to be chairing the session.
Thank you, Parma. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to the session, the Inspiring Ideas for Economics Education. We have three great speakers who will be discussing three different ways of inspiring ideas for economic education, ways of interacting with students and getting feedback and giving feedback. In the interest of time, I'm going to step aside and let the speakers commence. Our first speaker is Tobias Brevik. They are an economics PhD students at Florida State University studying decisions under risk and economic education. And they will be discussing a questionnaire they developed for educators to acquire actionable feedbacks from students. So as Yasmin is saying in the chat, please send your questions to the Q&A feature. Do not forget to indicate the first name of the panelists as well. All right, with that said, Tobias.
All right, give me 1 second to share my screen. Zoom is doing this, like, it gives me, sorry, technology. All right, awesome. So yes, hi, I am Tobias Brevik, or Toby Brevik, and today I'm going to be talking about a questionnaire that I developed to help me in class. I'm sort of early in my career as teaching. I'm a PhD student, and so I sort of started developing these questionnaires to get actionable feedback and to try to improve the experience of my students. So let's jump into that. So to start with, some of the questions that I ask. So one of these is, how do you plan to improve your understanding of the material? In addition to this, I also ask, what is confusing you, and what question do you have? And this sort of gets students to metacognate, think about how they're thinking, and to think about how they can sort of help themselves. Another question I ask is, what is causing you negative emotions? And I also ask, what is causing you positive emotions? The main reason of this is to give students more of an open platform to tell me things, right? I'm going to come back to these in a second. The other questions I ask are what I can do to improve their experience, and more broadly, what can be done to the course to improve the experience of it. Mostly, I'm going to be talking about these negative and positive emotions questions and some results that I found. So you've noticed that these questions are open-ended. So why do I use open-ended questions? To explain this, I'm going to tell you what I tell my students in a second. Here's an example of why we might want to use an open-ended question. So this is a question that gets asked at the end of Florida State's student evaluations of teaching at the end of the semester. And it asks students to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how the instructor's communication is. And the thing is, this does give us some information, especially if we can see if we're improving across semesters and things like that. But the thing is, we communicate with our students in a lot of ways, right? And so getting open-ended feedback gives students a platform to tell us if it's emails, if it's Canvas or Blackboard, if it's one-on-one in office hours, or if it's our lectures, and sort of what specifically we need to change. Are we using filler words too much? Are we a little too casual? Are we a little too formal? Things like that, right? And so using open-ended questions can give us a lot more richer information than we can necessarily get in these end of semester evaluations. So as I said, I talk about negative and positive emotions, or I ask them about these. So why do I do this? Now I'll tell you what I tell my students in my syllabus. So we're going to gain practice with goal setting, evaluation of your own progress, introspection, and understanding of how your emotions and other aspects of being human interact with your academic and professional endeavors, and how to harness your humanness to reach your academic and professional goals. I first do this to just acknowledge that we are emotional beings and that our emotions are necessary in all of the things we do. So this acknowledges this. This also gives students a way to think about their experience and to think about, well, what am I enjoying? Maybe I can lean into that enjoyment. What am I not enjoying? What can I do to improve that? And so it gives students a way and encourages them to think about their experience and think about how they're thinking. The other thing I do or say is that it gives me regular feedback on what parts of the material are confusing and what I might be able to do differently to help with clarity. And this is really what I'm going to focus on today. So you might be asking, well, in these questionnaires, how many students are responding? So these are graded, so you would think that participation is more. And what I have found is that it's a lot more for me. So my end of semester evaluations tend to be about a 50% participation rate. But when I did my questionnaires, which I also call journals, when I give these to students, I had a 98% participation rate, which means that if I have a class of 50, there's only one student that I am not hearing from. And for me, this is a very, very sizable improvement. But so you might be asking, okay, students are doing these, but are they giving information that's useful? So first, let me define what I mean by actionable feedback. So I define it as actionable if it either explicitly or implicitly provides a suggestion for at least one component of the course or teacher behavior that the teacher has the reasonable ability to modify or retain. So an example of something that might be explicitly actionable is something like, I think we should have fewer quizzes, or I think we should have more time on quizzes. And something that might be implicit is someone might say, I think there are too many quizzes. These sort of say the same thing, but one is explicit and one implicitly communicates the same suggestion, but not directly. Examples of non-actionable feedback might be something like, I don't like that the course is online. Well, I can't do anything about that, right? Or it might be something like, I am fine with everything. Well, that doesn't tell me anything particularly useful either. But so, thinking about this definition of actionable feedback, how much actionable feedback am I getting? I'm getting quite a bit. So I gave questionnaires 4 times in this semester, and I had between a 60% and 75% rate of number of students. This is a percentage of students giving me feedback that I can do something with, that I can at least consider doing something with. And that's already big. And then if you do this across the whole semester, at the end of semester evaluations, we're hearing from every student, we're hearing from them once, right? If we compare it to that, I'm getting actionable feedback from 94% of my students. And this includes students who didn't even participate. That's huge. That's really big, right? Because, when we do these end of semester evaluations and we are getting comments, we have these open-ended comments that they can do, participation is really low on that, but I'm getting rich feedback from a lot of students and across the entire semester. So you might be wondering, well, how students feel about this. This is something that I want to do future work to dig into, but for one student, I had a student say that something that causes them positive emotions is the journals or the questionnaires. And I had another student say that the idea of this journal assignment gives me positive emotions because it makes me feel like I can talk directly to the professor, just like a regular class in person, and express how I feel honestly about how things are going. So, this is just sort of anecdotal evidence right now, but basically I get the sense that my students feel like I'm approachable, and this gives them a way to talk to me even in an online course. And then you might be wondering, well, they're perceiving it well, but are issues getting resolved from their perspective, or do they maybe just like the fact that they can communicate, right? And what I found is that I had some students communicate to me that they felt like the changes that needed to be made were made. So I had, Tobias has already done everything possible. I'm satisfied with the course. And as we reached the end of the course, everything that could have been done to improve the course was done. So I do think it's important that when you get actionable feedback, that you do decide what to do with it, and you communicate what you are going to do and how you made those decisions. And if students can see that you are actually using this feedback, I think that that's really important. So my suggestions for sort of application of this is, for one, we're all sort of aware that there are biases in student evaluations of teaching. And I think that it is important that we recognize that there are probably going to be biases in these as well. So we ourselves need to be aware of biases that our students might have. And we also might want to tell students about biases they might be inclined to have, so that we can help mitigate that a little bit. We can also do things like identifying extreme answers using methods like sentiment analysis. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but basically you can get a measure of how positive or negative a response is, and isolate what you look at that way. And then I also wanted to say that I don't think this is just useful to teachers. I think that this can be used by educators broadly. So success coaching, academic advising, retention, we can, before we meet with our students, get more information about their experience that can help us move that conversation more efficiently. And we can also get feedback for us as other educators on our own interactions with students, and help us improve as well. So that's what I have. Here's my contact information again, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Thank you, Toby. Good timing. I hope my internet just dropped out halfway through your talk, so hopefully that will not be happening again. But if it does, I think at least I was able to get back online quickly this time. All right, we will be responding to all the Q&As at the end of the session. And so just for those of you who have asked Q&As, we will go through the Q&As at the end of the session. Next up, we have Tim Burnett, who is a senior lecturer at Aston University in Birmingham in the UK. I apologize if I butchered that. He will be presenting his research looking into the how and the why of using data as a tool in supporting our teaching in introductory economics.
Excellent. Thanks, Gail. And thanks, Tobias. That was an amazing presentation and really good ideas, because I think asking students to actually reflect on their ideas and certainly their emotions is, and pointing out potential biases to them, it sounds amazing. Anyway, we'll talk about it later. But back to my presentation. So I am going to be talking about data in economics. Okay, so let's see. Can you folks see my screen? Someone give me a heads up.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's start this slideshow. Okay, so yes, so I'm going to be talking about the role of data in teaching introductory economics modules. And this is being developed for a book chapter, but it came out of a presentation that I did in a symposium last year. So what's this research about? So what I really want to do is I want to think about, in terms of surveying, think about the range of different approaches that academics take when incorporating data in the teaching of micro or just general introductory economic theory. To think about how we can take all these this grand variety of approaches that no doubt exist, and think about how can we classify these approaches, and having classified these, think about, well, we have these classifications, how can we get the best out of the various approaches that are being delivered by lecturers? Because obviously everybody has subtle differences in their own approaches. I really want to identify the similarities between groups of methods approaches. The one thing I'm not going to do here, which I don't know, may be inspiring for some people or may make people happy, is I'm not actually going to say this is how you should be incorporating data in your teaching. people have been teaching for a lot longer than I have. We're in a pandemic. Everyone's tired, and the point is that actually, you know, I'm not gonna say, you know, this particular method is much better than the others. We should all be doing this. I'm just gonna really start thinking about, you know, how can we get the best out of what it is that we're doing. So, you know, telling people you're doing a good job, maybe tweak something. I don't know. So the approach I'm generally taking, well, at the moment, we're kind of in this kind of a starting point where we've got kind of a what I call a micro survey going on. So it's a very, very short survey, and sort of developing this conceptual framework from kind of learning theories. Now, what I've discovered over the past sort of few weeks, past couple of months, is that these are kind of naturally kind of talking to each other. So as people are answering the survey, it's kind of pushing me down particular routes in terms of learning theory, but then that learning theory is having to force me to adjust the survey a little bit. So the survey is subtly evolving, but not in major ways. And then from these, the next stage of the research is really thinking about, you know, given what we've learned from the survey, given the learning theory that we have there, sort of digging into some of the approaches that people are using through some kind of semi-structured interviews, but also in our survey, and it's like micro survey that I'm sure many of you or some of you might have filled out, really digging into these qualitative survey fields as well. But at present, we really are up at this part, and it's sort of this part, some quantitative summary and some kind of learning theory that I'm really going to focus on in this presentation. So I guess a useful starting point is to think, well, why do we use data? And this sounds like such a trivial question because everybody or most people do it, but it's always worth really taking a reflective pause to think about, well, why is it that we were actually using data? We use data so much in our teaching for certainly introductory economics. Well, it provides examples, right? And we know that we know how useful examples are. They get students' attention, it makes them less passive, it anchors ideas. But I mean, there are many other sorts of examples that can do this. You can, you know, numerous people have written about using Simpsons episodes to grab attention and to anchor ideas. And similarly, you know, it's building bridges between your existing knowledge and the content and learning that you as a lecturer might want to, between students' existing knowledge and content that you as a lecturer might want to develop. Okay. Crucially though, data starts kind of deviating from other sorts of examples. Certainly for intrinsically interested students, it's very relevant. They may get a kick out of using data because ultimately they have an interest in economics. And particularly, we perceive data analysis to be some kind of key proficiency within economics in a way that other forms of analysis, qualitative analysis or primary source analysis are not seen as key proficiencies. So this is reasons why we use data more than anything else. You know, we could wheel some members of the public out and ask them questions if we wanted to, which would be, if you like, a qualitative analysis, but we don't. We use data. So given that we use data and having sort of taken that moment to reflect, we can think about building a conceptual framework. So I want to think about it in terms of the timing of when in a class you might use data, whether data is used to stimulate interest before introducing some economic theory or concepts, or whether data is actually used to reinforce a concept or theory which we've actually taught in our classes. Similarly, there are different ways that we can actually teach or use the data in the classroom. Given that we're introducing data either before or after, we can either sort of use data in a sort of a transmissive way. So actually showing students graphs, showing students summaries, tables, statistics, in a kind of transmitting this information. Alternatively, you know, we can actually use data in a very experiential way. So giving students the time and space to work with the data that they have. So we have these two kind of extremes of a spectrum, and so I thought we can probably combine these to think about, if you like, a physical visual kind of analogy for the different approaches that we have. So where we have on our vertical the idea of stimulation versus reinforcement, and on our horizontal we have transmiss, so if you like lecturer-led, and transactional, which is transaction being the kind of the interplay between students, the back and forth, the construction of knowledge. So where, if you like, just thinking about these quadrants, this quadrant would clearly be linked to, if you like, looking at data after theory, but having students doing that. And up here we've got introducing data to motivate a theory led by the lecturer, and so on. So we've got some results from our survey. The survey is still ongoing, but we've got some interesting results. So just looking at a kind of a heat map of this of our responses. So the majority, well, not the majority, around 47% of the responses generally use data solely in a reinforcement capacity to reinforce a theory which they've introduced. 26% of the responses use data to stimulate students to get their attention before introducing a theory. And in terms of the teaching approach, looking at the heat map for that, most of the teaching involving data was actually student-led. Around 17% of the responses both either had it purely led by the lecturer or alternatively a bit of both. So let's put these together now and actually have a think about applying these to the full grid. And we get something like this. So 50% of the respondents only used data to reinforce and had that done by students. But if we track the heat map up, we've got some really interesting results here. 15% of the responses used data both for stimulation and reinforcement, but also had it delivered by both lecturer and students. And this was generally a case here of lecturers introducing a theory using data and then allowing students to go and play with data. So amazingly, we don't have many observations down here, and this is something that I need to investigate in the survey itself. And up here, we've got this 15% on our heat map of lecturers, if you like, just only using data for the purposes of introducing theory. So these are just as a previews of our results. What can we do with this? Well, we can think about, given that we've seen that there are some transmission approaches, there are some transactional approaches, we can think about how we get the best out of these approaches. So transmissions, great. Learning can be tightly regulated. It allows a focus on core competencies, nice alignment between teaching and assessment. But ensure that actually, because we are, if you like, telling students and hoping the students just pick up the information that we are transmitting to them, that there's potential implications for assessment of these of student learning. And the other thing with transactional and constructivist approaches is that often we need to do a lot of scaffolding in terms of, because we're allowing students the freedom to explore the data, thinking about how we can focus students on the task at hand. So that just about wraps us up, but just think about the next steps. My survey is still open and I would love people to continue filling it out. All this stuff is based around on a usable sample of about 50 responses, but of course, more is always better. To carry out the qualitative analysis I mentioned at the start, and then to start thinking about some consistencies between using this qualitative analysis to think about good practice and consistency between objectives and teaching approach, and obviously the big one about the implications for blended and remote learning. So thank you. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. Stop the share.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we've heard from Toby in regards to the questionnaire, and Tim in regards to us being surveyed in our use of data as a tool. And so finally, we'll have Sarah Jacobson, who's an environmentalist at Williams College here in the United States. She will be discussing her experience ungrading or self-grading in a higher level economics elective. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
All right, so can somebody confirm in some format that you can see me, hear me, and see my slides? I mean, see my slides? Yes, good, super, excellent. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you to Gina for chairing, and to Toby and Tim for those great discussions. I'm actually very interested in both of those. And I would say my topic fits a little bit closer with what Toby was talking about. But I think, yeah, I think I'm really interested in thinking about all these ideas together. So, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about grading or not grading. And if you've spent time around professors, or if you are a professor, then you probably have the experience of hearing professors complain about grading. So this is from Twitter. This is Playmobil adjunct professor. They say, me to my mom, want me to pick up some dinner. Mom, oh, I thought you had a lot to do today. Are you done with all of your grading? And the response is, I will never be done with my grading. And so, you know, I think this is a feeling that most of us have expressed at some point. You know, and then there are other ways to think about grading and critiques of grading. So this is from Jesse Stommel, who's really the parent of the modern ungrading movement. And the blog post that this is from is titled "Grades Are Dehumanizing. Ungrading is no simple solution." And so what Jesse writes is that there is copious evidence that grades are not a good measure of learning, that they inhibit intrinsic motivation, and that they create a competitive environment between students and hostile relationships between students and teachers. So it's kind of not a very positive assessment. We can't entirely remove grades yet because they are hard coded into so many of our educational systems, but teachers can and should raise our collective eyebrows at grades. And we should do this work together with students. So, you know, I am not against other people grading quite as much as Jesse Stommel is. I'll just tell you a little bit about why I chose to remove myself from the grading process, more or less, for some of the teaching that I've done over the last year. And I'll start with a little bit of my own personal background. So I grew up going to progressive schools. And so up until I went to college, for the most part, I didn't see grades myself. It was something that was outside of my experience. We worked on projects instead of tests, and we had evaluations at the ends of terms. And so my teacher would write some stuff about what I had done, and I would write some stuff about what my journey had been. And it was kind of understood in this teaching philosophy that not only are students too multidimensional and complicated to be distilled into a unidimensional, you know, numeric or alphabetical scale, the learning that we do is much more complicated and multidimensional. And so, so concerns with distilling it down that way. And yet I am a college professor now, and as Jesse Stommel's blog notes, the system that we're in does require grades to be submitted in most schools. And so I've been grading for years and feeling awkward about it. And then over this last year, or the last couple of years, I've been sort of hearing ideas about this ungrading concept. And then I found out that my friend in math here at Williams College, Chad Topaz, he has been ungrading in some of his classes. And so I talked to him and I said, I'm just going to dive in. I said, this is the time. So I did it this past year in 2020, 2021. So this is actually not a pandemic talk I'm giving, similar to Tim and Toby. This happened at the same time as the pandemic, but was not brought on by the pandemic. The class that I will be talking to you about is an upper level elective called the Economics of Environmental Behavior. And the format of the class happened to be hybrid. I had mostly in-person students, but some remote students. There were 13 or 14 students, and all of them were juniors or seniors. And it's a senior seminar that operates like a graduate seminar. I teach at a liberal arts school, and so this is how our senior seminars tend to be. We read papers together and then discuss them. And then the students do replication exercises that are econometric. They present additional readings to the class. And then the big assignment is a term paper that is an original research project that is scaffolded with a series of assignments throughout the semester. I also did ungrading with some independent study students over the course of the year, and that worked even better than it worked with the elective. But I'm going to focus for this talk on the elective. So what did the process look like? Well, as that Stommel quote mentioned, we are still in a system that requires grades. And so even though I'm personally uncomfortable with the idea of grades, at the end of the semester, the students did receive grades. That was definitely a thing. And that's why I'm calling it it's more like self-grading than ungrading. And there's still the sort of professorial hegemony, if you want to say it that way, which is that I still defined what are the assignments that are going to be done. And I still give a lot of feedback on the assignments. In fact, there is no reduction in grading time because I spent just as much time giving feedback on assignments as I would in any other semester. What's different, though, is that the students, they identified what they wanted to get out of the class. They identified their learning and their growth objectives. They evaluated themselves on those objectives. And then at the end of the semester, they proposed grades that they felt were most appropriate for themselves. And then I had the opportunity to accept those grades or overturn them. This was what I gave to students at the beginning of the semester, the sort of the nexus of the ungrading stuff and our learning management software to explain what we're doing. And some of my students, I should say, had done ungrading before in other classes, mostly not in STEM Plus classes. So some of the students had experience with ungrading, but I would say most did not. So the beginning of the semester, the students set goals for themselves on the dimensions they want to make progress on. I provided some example areas and some example goals. And I also asked them to say, how are you going to assess your progress toward this goal? And I met with students in the first week of class to discuss their goals for a half an hour to an hour for each student. Then halfway through the semester, the students all checked in on their goals. They assessed how they were doing so far. And then they also had the opportunity to revise and tweak any of the goals that they had made or the methods of assessment that they had initially proposed. And then again, I met with them individually to talk about how they were doing. Then at the end of the semester, they did the final self-assessment. And that's where they fully applied their modes for evaluating their progress towards their own goals. And then at the end, they proposed their own grade and explained why they thought it was the grade that was most appropriate for them. So the first question I always get asked by my colleagues is, did they all give themselves A's? And the answer is no. Most of them gave themselves A's, but honestly, it's a higher level elective at a liberal arts school. Most of them would have gotten A's anyway. So 9 of the 13 students who finished the class proposed A's for themselves. But I would say maybe 1 or 2 of those would not have gotten A's in a normal semester. And so, I looked at the grades that they proposed and I said, they felt that they met their goals and they explained really thoughtfully what their journeys were like. And so I was not inclined to overturn them. And there were non-A grades. In fact, the only grade change that I made was the student who proposed a B-. I thought that they were being overly harsh on themselves, so I bumped them up to a B. So there was no what I would perceive as damage in terms of the grade distribution, or very limited damage. On the plus side, I felt that the students were very engaged. They did amazing work. They were wonderful students, but students reported this sense of intellectual freedom. So here's a couple of quotes and reflections. One student said, I think I did a very good job fulfilling the goals I laid out for myself. Admittedly, those were probably non-traditional goals, they said. Another student who thinks of themselves as a very high-performing student, they said that in their other classes, they always felt like they had to check boxes. They had to do this to get the A. They had to speak up in class just the right times and just the right way. And they felt like they could engage in a more thoughtful way this semester. And I thought that was wonderful. And another student, this really touched me, said, this class has shown me that the different types of smarts are just that different. And so for me, that says to me that this really worked to achieve the goals I wanted it to. It had students engage with the learning process in a more complex and thoughtful way. I will do this again. Thank you, Gina. And I am looking forward to doing this again. I will do it in electives. My department, I think, would not be that pleased with me doing this in intermediate microeconomics, which is my core course that I teach. But I see no reason to continue doing this in other classes. And I think that the only major thing that I would change from the structure that I have, which I think balanced pretty well the work that I was putting in with the benefit that was coming out of it, was maybe providing a little more guidance to students on setting the goals at the outset, which they found kind of challenging. So with that, I will stop and thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to give everyone in the audience just a minute or two, let's say 10:40, to look through the Q&A questions and to post your own Q&A questions while the presenters come back online and review them as well. So there is a function that you can use to upvote questions. So if there's a question you really want to have asked, please upvote it so that we can all take a moment. And I am giving you all a moment to look through it and add your own questions as well. At the end of CTEL, we will put together the Q&A document, and we will add answers on there as well. So you can also, even if we don't get to your question during the live session, your question will be answered in one format or another. So like I said, I'll just give everyone a few more minutes just to give you time to process these great presentations and figure out if you have your own questions or if you want to upvote somebody else's questions, and also to give the presenters time just to scroll through those Q&As to be prepared. Yes, there are a lot of great questions here. And I think we will just focus, for our own sanity, we'll focus on the Q&A box rather than the chat. I do realize there is a bit of back and forth happening in the chat, but I think, I don't know how comfortable people have become with multiple screens, multiple chat menus, all of these things. All right, so I am going to get started. Tim, you have the most upvoted question. Is there evidence on which combinations are more effective for student learning yet? Do you have that, or are you just at the point where you're still trying to figure out what systems are people using? You're muted.
Technology, eh? So it's a really good question. It's a really interesting question. And I'm really pleased that someone has asked this question. So I think, as I said at the start, one thing I was really trying to avoid with this particular exercise is the idea that we start ranking different methods of teaching quants in such a way that you might end up with some kind of prescriptive exercise or telling people this is how you should teach quants, when we know that the students that you teach to, the individual style of teaching, all these things are going to completely moderate the effectiveness of any particular teaching strategy. So I think answers to these sorts of questions are going to be a lot more nuanced than simply, is one method better than the other? I mean, you can dig into the literature on either experiential learning or kind of transmissive learning, and find advocates and critics of both. I didn't have a question on the effectiveness of teaching within the survey. It didn't really feel right. But what I will be doing in the next stages, when I actually talk to people and kind of just dig into how people felt about their courses, is to get their feelings about, if not necessarily, the students' performance, actually try to get at a slightly deeper level about how they felt students did. Did they improve the students? Did the students enjoy it? So yeah, but that's something definitely for the next stage of the research.
Especially if you're doing intro courses, just the pass-through rate, people, as another way of measuring it. All right, the next question is for Sarah, originally from Mena Bazuna, and I think it's tied into a question from Brendan Sheridan a little bit further down. So I'm going to ask you both at the same time. So the question from Professor Bazuna is, how similar or different were the learning objectives among the students? The question just appeared. So we look on the other tab. How similar or different were the learning objectives among the students, and how did those match with your expectations of what the students should walk away with the class? And that ties in with this other question from Brandon Sheridan, is what were the typical goals the students set for themselves, and are they really in the position to even set those goals? And how would that work with the learning goals that you expected or that you have set for the course?
That's great questions, and happy to hear from Mena, who's a grad school buddy of mine. So I was actually kind of surprised by some of the goals. So some of the goals were kind of students repeated back to me example goals that I suggested to them. So for example, more familiarity with data, because I felt like if I didn't suggest some goals, then it would just be too difficult of a problem for students to figure out what they should put down. But more familiarity with data was pretty common. I think increased ability to read econ and understand econ journal articles and to understand theory. Those were some common ones that were more or less things that I'd suggested. But some students had very specific subject matter goals that they wanted to learn. So for example, one really wanted to learn about fisheries, which unfortunately we weren't really doing in the class. So I thought that was, but at least it let me guide that student towards some resources on fisheries that hopefully were helpful. The one most interesting and instructive example of a goal that I would not have foreseen, but that multiple students put down, was they wanted to be able to talk about the concepts from the class and explain them to random friends and family that were not economists. And that's not a thing that I would have thought is a priority, but as I think about it, most of them are not going to go on to get a PhD. And so that sort of translation actually is a completely meaningful skill. So, I decided that it was appropriate for them to be able to pursue that goal and prioritize that goal. And so I think that I felt good about releasing my sense of control over the goals that the students set. And I felt that, in terms of their ability to assess their progress towards the goals, I asked them for their metrics of how they were going to assess them. And I talked through with them, are these metrics really going to work? Are you going to be able to monitor your progress? So, it was interesting, I thought, but also I thought really instructive and might change my teaching in other classes where I don't even do this.
And a follow-up question, which is from Yasmin R. From Clodagh Jenkins. How do you think ungrading would work with larger classes? I've seen 200 here and I've seen 50 here. I know there's a 50 student class I would love to use this in, but it seems tough.
Yeah. So I think that you would have to do a more mechanized and automated process. So you could not have 3 one-hour meetings per semester with each of the students if you have 500 students in your class or whatever. Like, that's not going to work. But I do have a friend here, my friend Chad, who uses it for a bigger and core class. And I think that the way you would have to do it is you would just have to make the check-ins a little bit less high touch. but I think it could work. You would just need to, maybe if you have TAs that can help you process the goals and respond to them, and make the meetings shorter, or make fewer meetings. I think it would work. I think it would just require a little bit of innovation.
And I'm sure that we will see some journal articles coming down the pipeline soon in either G or JET about ways in which to do ungrading or self-grading in larger courses too. And we have a comment as well saying that that communication skill of students communicating economics outside is one of the 5 competencies in economics that All Good and Bio 2016 identify as one of their 5 competencies in their framework that we might want to consistently target. All right, next up from Stephen Proud to Tobias. Following on from Carlos's question, do you have any concerns about linking journals with grades? My worry in the UK and my worry from the US as well is that students would be acting instrumentally to get those extra credit or to try not to offend you, however they might play. Is there any indication that this would give a better signal than a voluntary journal without that extra credit component?
This is a great question, and I've seen things in lower. So I want to first address how I did these, because I didn't do that very well in my presentation. So they weren't extra credit; they were required. They were, I think, about 10% of their grade or so. I also put in small activities at the bottom so that there was content-related things in there as well. Things like inspired by small teaching activities and things like that. I also, they were not anonymous, so students' names were attached to these all the time. As far as the concern that students might be saying things that are just nice, they don't. I considered putting that in my slides, but I didn't particularly want to advertise my students, what my students perceive as flaws in my teaching, here. But yeah, I get the sense, and also doing things with sentiment analysis, the distribution is maybe a little bit shifted positively, but students still say negative things. And then as far as delivery of this, so as far as, could I make it anonymous? Could I make it for extra credit? Could I make it, optional? Things like this. That is all stuff that I would love to do future work on. So these are questions that I don't really have great answers to, but it's really, I really love that y'all are asking these. It's really, telling me that this is definitely important work to be doing in the future. I have some ideas about how I can explore some of these things. And if you want to contact me and have more conversations about this, I would love to. Yeah, did that roughly answer the question?
Yes, it did. There was a slight follow-up that I had forgotten to add on from Carlos Cortinas. In the UK, you cannot give extra credits. So what advice would you give to somebody who cannot award the grades, which I think gets into what you were talking about in terms of your follow-up research as well?
Yeah, I would say that it's mostly going to be a sort of follow-up question. Yeah, I'm really hesitant to try to give an answer without sort of exploring that in a more formal capacity first.
I do think it's similar to mid-semester or mid-quarter evaluations, which are popular. And I think there's going to be a nice segue there, where they've sort of, I know even here, we've reintroduced them for people who have been teaching for many years as part of the pandemic. Another question from Carlos to Tim. I assume there's a big difference between quants modules and non-quant modules in terms of how the data is used. And I was going to ask a follow-up in similar, also I would imagine in metrics, even though I assume your quiz was on introduction, you might have gotten some metrics as well. I can imagine very different approaches. Yeah,
so I think I might have not made this particularly clear. I was really looking at intro theory modules. So introductory micro, how we use theory in introductory micro or introductory macro or principles of economics. So, and there were some responses where people just said, no, I don't use quant data at all in these modules. So I did try, there was a question in there in the survey asking people not how important data was to their module, but if suddenly all the data that they used was suddenly just wiped off the face of the earth, how would that affect their module? And some people said, well, it just wouldn't affect it at all, really. And there's some people said it would be catastrophic. But yeah, so I guess the question was about quant versus non-quant modules, and I think that was probably just me not explaining things very well in my presentation.
So next up, Sarah, Carlos Cortinas asks again, you got me thinking, but I'm wondering if you're helping your students get ready for the workplace. How do you think employers respond to ungrading?
Sure, and I saw that there's two other questions that I can answer really quickly that are right after that. One is, does it let you rank students? And I would say, first of all, I hate ranking students. whenever I get a form, I'm like, oh, I hate this. So the students get a grade at the end. So as meaningful as you thought that grades were before, if you think these grades are more or less meaningful than the ranking that comes out based on the grades, whatever, you can choose how you feel about that. And the second question is, are there any regulations that prohibit it? So I'm at a small liberal arts school that we jokingly call an adhocracy. Those of you who are at similar schools know what I'm talking about. There aren't really regulations. We do whatever we want. I don't actually know whether there are places where this would not be allowed. I would be kind of surprised if that was the case. But I think that to Carlos's question that you mentioned, Gina, I think I can actually just turn around and point to what somebody put in the chat, which is that and I myself used to work in the private sector, and we did 360-degree evaluations. We did self-evaluations. That was part of how people work. That is part of how people work in the workforce, is reflecting on how they're doing. And other people also reflect on how they're doing. But I think learning that skill of self-reflection in a relatively honest way, I think is pretty useful. So unless you actually think that those grades are contaminated in some way so that people will look at the GPA and say, I don't believe that, which I don't know, given that people always say all these things about grade inflation, I'm not sure that's not the case already. I think that, unless you think that those grades are in some way more contaminated than they were before, I would think that this is actually useful experience for students before they go into the workforce.
All right, so you answered the next two questions from Carlos Cortinas and Nazanin Kasra. Hi, Nazanin. I think Dean seems more of a comment than a question, unless, Tim, you can see a question in there. Okay, and then Brandon's question I asked above. So next one is from Phil Ritter to you, Sarah, again. I teach in a private university that's not particularly selective. Do you think the effectiveness of your ungrading approach would work at an institution that does not attract many elite students?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And obviously I haven't tried it, so I can't say. I would say that unless you have some reason to think that non-elite students are going to be more likely to self-inflate, I think it could be a powerful experience for those students who are not considered elite, as it is for others. I mean, it might be even more helpful in that kind of a setting to help students set goals that are the most appropriate for themselves. And you might choose, if you're the instructor there, to say, I want those goals to be more ambitious. But I'm not necessarily convinced that that would be a problem. I don't have empirical evidence on this, so I would be very curious if people tried it at a less elite, in quotation marks, place. But I think it should work.
All right, I think we don't really have time for more questions. Well, I think we can sort of wrap up one more question. I just want to give people time to, if you just want to glance through quickly, but let's see. Just give people just a second to vote up if they want to. Other than that, I'm going to take. And so the comment was the comment from before, in case this, for people watching the video after the fact, was that there's a lot of students, to Tim, a lot of students are but data phobic. And so there is fear of data they think of it as metrics. The metrics is difficult, so you do have that problem with introduction, and then a comment as well. When you use data in intro macro, they feel much more motivated than when they are learning models. And I don't know if you had any experience or thoughts on that based on your work with the learning models that you've been encountering while you're structuring your quiz, because you were saying that as you are structuring the survey, you keep going back and forth with these models. I was wondering if you had any insights there.
I don't have any specific insights. I have my own views, which are not strictly part of the survey, but you know, I've taught a lot of courses, quant courses, to non-specialists, and I think it's something we need to tread a little bit carefully with the assumption that there's no way that we can dress data up in such a way that students might find it interesting. I think, you know, whether or not you start them gently, I think experiential methods actually works quite well with students, actually giving them a sense of agency, as opposed to, if you like, just throwing data and graphs at them, and actually just, I'd say, promoting the sense of agency and the sense of autonomy actually might empower students. But I'd say whether it does or whether it doesn't, I don't know for certain at the moment.
All right. Thank you very much. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Parama for Mixer directions.
Thanks very much, Gina, and thank you to the presenters. Again, I think a conversation that seems to be just starting rather than finishing. I just wanted to say that in 4 minutes, our first network mixer will be starting. You will have the link to this in your inbox, in your spam somewhere. So do have a look. The mixers will start with our sponsors talking a little bit about their EdTech product. In this case, it's Echo 360, and there was a discussion about back channels for interaction in the panel. So this is something that they do quite a bit of. But most of the network mixer will be breakout discussion rooms with the rooms themed in terms of sessions that we have. So if you want to continue this, that will be in the breakout room. So you will get a chance to do that, or to have any other discussion about any of the other sort of topics that we'll be covering in the conference. Tomorrow, obviously, we start again, as usual, 3 p.m. British summertime, whatever that is, wherever you are. You will have all the links to the different sessions. Again, there'll be a network mixer at the end. Yeah, that's it for me. I'm going to hand over to our support group, who will end this webinar and open the network mixer. So I will see you guys over there.